For those of you who are just popping in now, my name is Jackie Feldman. I am the Executive Director of Zygote Press. And tonight we are here to present a wonderful program to you on the history of printmaking. And we welcome all of you to this program. I just want to tell you a few words about some of the other things that we do. In addition to our online programs, we're also very happy to once again be offering in-person workshops at our Cleveland print shop. We have some wonderful classes coming up, including embossed printmaking with Patricia Brett, who's from New York City. And that's going to be offered on Saturday, April 2nd and Sunday, April 3rd from 10 to 2. It's a very special opportunity to study with Patricia, who is a successful New York City printmaker and our brand new teaching artist. She's also a sculptor, a painter, printmaker, and a former architect. And she's a graduate of Yale's graduate program in architecture. She will be teaching students how to make prints using only light and shadow and no ink. We also have an all levels mono printing intensive workshop coming up with Zygote Press artist Lisa Schoenberg on Saturday, April 16th and Sunday, April 17th from 10 to 2. And there are only 4 spots left in that workshop. So if you're interested, I would hurry up and sign up for that one. There are other workshops available as well. Please check them out on our website. I see Abby has just dropped a link. So if you follow the link in the chat, you will be able to see what other workshops are coming up. If you ever have any questions about workshops, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're available both through email or you can give us a call and leave a message and we will call you back. We are able to provide free programs like this one thanks to our supporters. If you would like to support Zygote, please consider becoming a community member. Our community membership is only $50 a month, a year. And it's only $25 for students and seniors. As a member of Zygote Press, you receive a 25% discount on all of our classes and workshops, and you receive access to open studio hours to work on your own projects. And we have open studios twice a week, every week. And as well as all of that, you get a 10% discount in our art store for any of the purchases of our fine art. When you support Zygote Press, you're supporting a nonprofit arts organization committed to creating opportunities for artists through an open door, accessible studio space, and an affordable educational programming in a collaborative, supportive community. So we're very grateful to all of you who have supported us in the past, and we're looking forward to working with those of you who are new to Zygote Press. With that, I would like to now introduce our presenter tonight, who is Zygote's Senior Program Manager and Art Historian, Brittany M. Hudak. Brittany Hudak has over 20 years of experience working in the arts. She received an MA in Art History from the University of Cincinnati and a Master of Arts with distinction from the University of London. At the Cincinnati Art Museum, she did key research and developed programming for the award-winning Cincinnati Wing, led docent training, as well as several exhibition-related programs and talks. At the Wellcome Museum in London, she led public tours and worked in the collections interpretation department. Brittany has taught undergraduate art history at Case Western Reserve University and Cleveland State University and has curated many exhibitions across Northeast Ohio. As an arts writer, she has been a featured writer and critic for the Collective Arts Network Journal for the past 8 years and was the recipient of the 2020 Ohio Excellence in Journalism Award. Please help me give a big welcome to Brittany Hudak.
Gosh, thanks, Jackie, for that fabulous introduction. I'm really excited to be here tonight. I am going to share my screen now. Okay, that's not where we're supposed to start. How does that look? Okay. Hopefully everyone can see the full screen now. The title of my talk today is Blanche Lazzell and the Independent Women of Provincetown. Queerness and Networks of Printmaking. It's an ongoing research project that I'm currently working on, so it's kind of in the beginning stages, but I'm really happy to be able to share an introduction to this work tonight via this presentation. But before I begin, I want to recognize the people whose work inspired me to start this research in the first place. Firstly, the 2010 exhibition held at the Cleveland Museum of Art of the work of Mabel Hewitt, which was organized by curator of prints Jane Glaubinger. It was a really rare opportunity to see a number of whiteline woodcuts and blocks by this renowned Cleveland artist. So hopefully some of you got to catch that. I'd also like to thank Zygote teaching artist and printmaker Eugene Sarmiento, whose whiteline workshop last year, we actually offered an online whiteline workshop, kind of inspired me and reminded me of that show and pushed me to start this research. And as far as a theoretical framework, I'm indebted to the scholarship of Karen Kralik, whose dissertation at Brown and then the subsequent book she wrote on the history of Provincetown's queer culture asked scholars to pay closer attention to the ways in which our methodologies that utilize LGBTQ studies and queer theory can combine rather than separate queer histories and communities. She stresses that the global mechanics of capitalism led to the local queering and eventually unqueering of the very gentrified, extremely white, gay and lesbian enclave at Provincetown today. So I am extremely indebted to her work as well. But speaking of Provincetown, to begin my talk, I wanted to give a brief overview of the town itself. Provincetown, as you can see here, I hope you can see, no, because my little face is in the way. Provincetown is at the northernmost tip of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The seaside town is actually on the site of the Mayflower's landing in 1620, an event that was commemorated by the towering Pilgrim Monument, which you can actually see here in the center of this postcard. It's nearly an island, and it's exactly what you would think it is. It's a provincial, quaint, New England typical village. It's about 4 miles long and barely more than 2 miles wide at its widest point. It's surrounded by steel blue waters and white sandy beaches. It's also referred to quite frequently as Land's End or Cape End, and now it is known as Queersville, USA. But Provincetown has meant different things to different people over the years. From the very first Anglo-European colonial settlers, who then began importing laborers primarily from Portugal, these two groups began jockeying for the town's limited space and economic resources. Portuguese sailors and their families developed a neighborhood on the west end of town, while the white Yankees, as they're known as, lived in the east side. But when the 1898 Portland gales severely damaged the town's fishing industry, things began to shift. Like many colonial seaside towns, Provincetown handled the decline of its lucrative 19th century fishing industry by turning its rotting wharves and narrow dirt roads and scenic beaches into a tourist destination. And it was artists who played the key role in this transformation. Okay. Provincetown was filled with abandoned buildings by the turn of the century that were affordable and available. And as word got out, artists began flocking to this little village. And as the town began to be rumored as artsy, meaning tolerant of difference in the name of creativity, queer men and women increasingly visited from their places of intolerance. And although a similar thing was happening around the same time in Greenwich Village, not all art colonies became gay meccas. And And it's here that I want to acknowledge that Provincetown has always been a destination for the privileged, and it still is very much so today. The artists I will be talking about are all white and affluent financially. And despite the fact that they were seeking freedom in Provincetown, once there, they ended up creating new forms of discrimination, displacing the very people that welcomed them there in the first place. And this is a pretty typical postcard of some artists, a lot of artists working on a beach in Provincetown. The artists that first transformed Provincetown into an art colony were not queer, nor were they even progressive. In fact, they were in the main very conservative men, such as Charles Webster Hawthorne, who opened the Cape Cod School of Art in 1899, which was said to be the first outdoor school for figure painting in America. And what made Hawthorne so key to the transformation of Provincetown into an art colony was his decision not only to go and to paint at Land's End, which was something that artists have been doing, for over a century in France and in other places, but in addition to just painting there, he decided to give instruction there. On any summer day, you could easily come across Hawthorne teaching a large group of elegantly dressed women painting on the waterfront. And his school attracted literally hundreds of art students and dozens of well-known artists and multitudes of tourists, believe it or not, that actually came to watch them paint, which seems a little odd now, but there was no TV or movies. You can see here in this image, there's people, they're not painting, they're actually just watching him paint. And there's similar images that you can find pretty easily of tourists that actually came to Provincetown to watch artists paint en plein air or outdoors. And that postcard that I showed before, you could even send a postcard home to show how you came to see the artists working. In 1900, a less traditional artist, a modernist named Ambrose Webster, opened his summer school of painting. And then more schools started to open. And by 1916, roughly 600 artists and students were spending the summer in Provincetown at 6 different art schools. Artist Marsden Hartley called that summer of 1916 the Great Summer, because many artists like Hartley had recently returned to America from either Berlin, Paris, or London because of the outbreak of World War I. Many of these artists had experienced the relaxed attitudes towards sex in these European cities, and they liked it and had become accustomed to it. And getting word that there was a similar town on Cape Cod that was open to such people, these artists began flocking there. The Boston Globe ran a page 1 story headlining "Biggest Art Colony in the World in Provincetown" in 1916. As Provincetown became a serious place to study art, with it came reports of the artists' risque summertime antics. Outrageous parties, gender-bending costume balls. Increasingly, Provincetown became a place where people with non-traditional sexual preferences could safely explore their identity. So you have free thinkers from Greenwich Village coming to Provincetown, including painters like Marsden Hartley, who you see here in the dunes, and Charles Demuth, another modernist painter, and he's with Eugene O'Neill, the famous playwright, who also started the Provincetown Players around this same time, a kind of avant-garde theater group. These people collected there because of, in some ways, because of Provincetown's remoteness. It's virtually surrounded by water, and the town's isolation really let visitors explore, shed their inhibitions and anonymity. And some of it had to do, and a lot of it had to do with the Portuguese boarding house owners. So confirmed bachelors and maiden ladies, which are the coded words used to describe such people, formed really trusting relationships with their Portuguese hosts and hostesses who were eager to have the additional income and were not bothered by their sexuality as long as sex and gender bending men and women were white and arrived with income to spare. Portuguese homeowners were more than pleased, and more often than not, to take them in, especially as the fishing culture was in the decline. So, oh, and I wanted to say, on the right here, you can see the Beachcombers, which was an all-male art club that was not overtly openly gay, but it still exists today and is now an openly gay men's organization. So it's in this complex framework that I just described of conservative art schools, open gay and lesbian artists, and welcoming Portuguese hosts that a group of printmakers banded together to form what they called the Provincetown Printers. And it was really a convergence of not only this complex framework, but also of Paris, Japan, Chicago, Cincinnati, this result of networking of artists who were moving between American art schools, the ateliers of Paris, and the influence of Japanese art, all that synced together in the summer of 1915. So before the age of computers, artists, largely worked and traveled by word of mouth, making associations with like-minded individuals. They traveled together, they supported each other, and they taught each other new techniques and ideas. So in this world of economic and artistic privilege, some were able to openly express their sexual identities. And Provincetown offered that, just that, like a place of possibility rather than limitation. Nearly all the Provincetown printers had visited Europe and had had a chance to study printmaking either in Paris, Germany, or at their respective art schools. But it is important to note that women were traditionally very much excluded from professional print shops at this time. So techniques such as lithography and etching were often considered too physically demanding for women to pursue professionally. But as you can see, a majority of the Provincetown printers were indeed women, and many of them were queer. All of them were affluent. As I'm saying, they're crisscrossing the Atlantic at their will, and they had more opportunities than most women to learn printmaking, but none of them had a press in Provincetown. And because of their kind of transient nature, moving, like I said, between Paris, New York, and Provincetown, and the lack of an accessible press, it was the white line technique that many of them chose to use precisely because you don't need a press or access to a print shop to create them. So what exactly is the white line technique? It's pretty simple and easy to grasp. It begins with a simple linear design, usually drawn in pencil on a wood block, and then only the lines are gouged away into very slender grooves. Then, as you can see here on this print by Sandy Webster, a piece of moistened paper is tacked to one edge of the printing surface so that it can be folded over, which then assures that your registration will be correct. And then the artist brushes watercolors onto the printing surface, not ink, actual watercolors, which had just been, recently widely available in tubes. So you didn't have to mix your own pigments anymore. And those chiseled grooves then separate out the cells of color and keep the paint from running together or mixing. Well, if you do it right anyway. And then you lay the paper over the inked surface, and the print is made simply by rubbing the back of the sheet with a simple burnishing tool like a wooden spoon. And the resulting image has very distinctive white lines where the grooves separate the colors. Now, this differs very greatly from the traditional method of creating multicolored woodblock prints, which requires the artist to actually carve a separate block for each color. And then you have to very carefully register the paper for each impression to create the finished image. And this is based on a traditional Japanese method of printmaking called mokuhanga. And these are contemporary prints by Daphne Clifton, but you can see here, you know, that for each color, she has to create a different block. This method is obviously very labor intensive, the traditional method, but the white line method encourages the artist to create extremely linear, flat, and geometric compositions, which were favored by artists that at this time considered themselves modern. These artists admired the work of European modernists who were likewise employing flat geometric images in their paintings, like the Cubists, for example. And it was also the influence of the European modernists, like the Cubists, and their affinity for Japanese mokuhanga prints that led to this white line printmaking method. Here we see Hokusai's The Great Wave, and this is a single print that was made from at least 8 blocks, maybe 10. So by the, you know, that's a very labor intensive process, but by the turn of the century, Japanese prints were all the rage in Paris and Europe and influenced an entire generation of artists. This trend, which is known as Japanisme, it coincided with modern art's radical upending of the Western, you know, artistic tradition, and it had significant effects on Western painting and printmaking. Many late 19th century modern artists not only admired Japanese print, they collected them themselves and then derived and adapted both compositional and stylistic approaches from those prints. So here you see a painting by Whistler of a woman wearing, you know, a white woman wearing Japanese costume, completely surrounded by Japanese art, screen, and then also prints, which you can see are just laying all over the floor. And while he was not making prints per se, Van Gogh was copying Japanese prints. Here on the left is a Hiroshiga, and on the right is a painting that Van Gogh did after Hiroshiga. And you can see then he also, here's another one that he did. So these are studies for him in compositional technique. Sorry, there's lots of motorcycles going by. And perspective, which he then used for his own paintings. But he didn't make that many prints. He did make some prints, but some artists like Mary Cassatt did make prints, and she had access, she was incredibly wealthy and had access to a printing press. So she was copying Japanese prints, but not in the mokuhanga method. She's using a Western technique, such as this dry point, to imitate the composition of Japanese prints. But none of these artists that I just described are attempting to recreate traditional mokuhanga woodblock prints simply because of the detailed technical expertise and time required to make them, but they all admired the look of Japanese prints and the ease with which one can make them with a woodblock, but without a press. And somehow all of these networks of influence and artistic knowledge coalesced around 1915 in Provincetown, when the artist B.J.O. Nordfeldt supposedly invented the white line technique. Here you can see an example of his work from 1916. It depicts a fisherman's family in Provincetown. In an often referenced quote from artist Ada Gilmore, who granted was recalling this moment nearly 50 years later, but she attributes the discovery of white line printmaking to B.J.O. Nordfeldt. I'm going to read the quote. "One day he surprised the others by exhibiting one block with his complete design on that one block, instead of parts of it being cut on 5 or 6 blocks. He had cut a groove in the wood to separate each color, and in printing this left a white line which emphasized the design. With this invention, he had produced a more beautiful picture and eliminated much work. Immediately, woodblock printing was revolutionized. Being able to see the complete picture on one piece of wood, like a painting on a canvas, gave new possibilities for creative work in that medium. I mean, it's pretty apocryphal account, and I don't know if it probably likely didn't happen in one moment, but like I said, was rather the combination of all of these influences and people's work that came together. But what definitely happened was that a group, mostly women, many of whom were queer, immediately took up this method as their primary way of art making. And returning to Provincetown year after year, they not only made whiteline printing a popular form of art, they also taught students the technique, primarily women, who then returned to their hometowns to share that knowledge. So we will start with Ethel Mars and Maud Squire, who you can see here. This is actually in Springfield, Illinois. Maud Squire and Ethel Mars were both from very affluent families, and they met at the Art Academy of Cincinnati, where they were both kind of the stars of the illustration department. As students, their work was shown in a joint exhibition, just the two of them, in the Art Museum in Cincinnati in 1903. So you can see here that's Ethel and Maud. This is actually Edna Boyce Hopkins, who also became a whiteline printmaker. This is all their class, and this is their teacher, Lewis Henry Meakin, a pretty famous Cincinnati artist. They also studied with Frank Duveneck. So out of this class of women, 3 of them all worked in Provincetown as whiteline printmakers. In 1906, after their graduation, the couple moved to France and began traveling through Europe. Among their notable friends in Paris was Gertrude Stein, the famous lesbian writer and art collector, and they were a really active part of her Paris salon alongside Picasso and Matisse and all the other luminaries of the Paris avant-garde. So much so were they a part of this scene that Stein actually wrote a short story titled Miss Spur and Miss Skeen in 1922 that is based on Ethel Mars and Maud Squire. And it contains rather oblique references to the artist's life, such as visiting family and Squire's brother in Paris, but it's kind of a joke story. Like it uses repetition. In fact, the story uses the word gay over 100 times. So I even found this little meme on the internet today that has a quote. So here's a quote from it. They were regularly gay. They were gay every day. They ended every day in the same way at the same time, and they had been every day regularly gay. And it's considered the first literary use of gay being used to mean homosexual about 50 years before that became common, but it's playing on the multiple meanings of gay, obviously, referring to their relationship, happy attitudes, and how they loved vivid colors, the way they dressed and in their art. And they were really known for their bold fashion choices, especially dyeing their hair. They dyed their hair purple, flamingo orange, as they said in one letter, and half bleached and half black, which is cool now. But they also wore very heavily colored makeup and bright clothing. Their appearance was compared to a Matisse painting. So they're wearing like green lipstick and orange eyeshadow with violet hair. So they're definitely signaling to the world that they are different. And they're traveling around Europe and they're largely accepted. They're accepted in Gertrude Stein's circle. They go to Munich, where they actually learn how to make woodcuts, which then became the focus of their practice. After World War I, where both of them were actually ambulance drivers for a time on the front, but found that it was a little bit dangerous, they relocated to Provincetown, Massachusetts. And there the women became close to the other Provincetown artists who were known for making these whiteline woodcuts. And Ethel in particular embraced the white line technique, making several prints depicting the town, depicting her friends gardening or relaxing, you know, private, secluded moments like this, a woman with a fan and sunflowers, really enjoying the leisurely lifestyle that Provincetown in the summer provided. And another thing that she did a lot of was showing the private spaces that women moved in. At this time, like this is a dressing room image. At this time, women were still required to wear these ridiculously large, heavy wool swimming suits in public, which you can see here on the figure in the right. And the woman on the left is dressed rather flamboyantly. So she's got a short bob haircut, you know, and she's kind of indicative of the kind of modern attitudes in dress and appearance that these two women had. Like I said before, the queer artists, the Ethel and Maud both dyed their hair, and then they brought that to Provincetown. And so then you see other Provincetown queer women dyeing their hair. Flora Schofield is dyeing her hair. Edna Boyce Hopkins dyes her hair. So they're dyeing their hair these crazy colors, cutting their hair into fashionable bobs, and they're wearing eccentrically bright and patterned clothing. All of this was signaling not only their identity as an artist, I am a serious artist, but also as queer women, or as the press called them, independent women. And this was another one of those coded terms that the press used to describe women of questionable sexual preferences. As one writer said, Mars and Squire lived a life independent of men's conventions. And so that's implying that they lived their lives, you know, not alone, like independent, but they lived their lives without the support of men and not in a man's world. Maud, I had to include this picture of Maud with their cat because look at that, look at that little guy. Anyway, Maud, unlike the others, didn't work in Whiteline while in Provincetown, but she developed what I would call a simplified woodblock technique. And her compositions were mainly inspired by the seaside's town, boats, harbors, fishing culture. But what she did is she would only make 2 blocks. So the one block would be like almost like a white line block with the colors fit into each section. And then she would make a key block for the black lines that went on top of that. And so that's the result that you see here. This is a multicolored print, but it was created with only 2 blocks. So this eliminates that distinctive white line, but it also makes her prints look like they were created with 1 million blocks, even though they weren't. And this is the kind of innovation that woodblock printing allowed these artists. And Maud Squire's experimentation with the technique shows how far this one artist ran with her ideas in this environment where experimentation was encouraged. And like the other Provincetown printers, her compositions are very angular, geometric, with very flat, broad areas of color. Her prints of bathers particularly feature her friends. So you're looking there on the left at bathers from the artistic set. They kind of are a foil to her other image of Portuguese fishermen. And that really shows the dichotomy of a town that was rapidly changing from an industrial seaport with Portuguese fishing culture to the playground for elite white vacationers such as Maud Squire and Ethel Mars. Mars and Squire formed a small professional and social circle with other same-sex couples and artists. 2 women in particular who worked with Maud and Ethel in Europe and then joined them in Provincetown were Ada Gilmore and Mildred Dolly MacMillan. Likewise, unconventional in their looks and attire, they were another relatively out couple in Provincetown making prints at this time. Like Maud Hunt and Ethel Mars, they met at art school, In fact, their stories are very similar, but they met in Chicago at the Art Institute. And then they traveled to France, where they both actually studied woodblock printing with Ethel Mars in Paris. And in 1915, the couple joined Mars and Squire in Provincetown, where, unlike most artists, they actually didn't leave in the winter. They stayed for the winter and lived at the very tip of Cape Cod through the very harsh winters. As you can see, this is their Christmas card from 1918. It's a woodblock print, and you can also see they have a cat named Pico, and how she's smoking a cigarette. They have a very relaxed attitude and pose. They're gathered around the wood stove because, as you can imagine, in the winters, it was very cold there. But the fact that they made a Christmas card together, shows just how open they were about their partnership. As you can see, over the years, scholars have reckoned with this in differing ways. So one curator recently referred to them as housemates. They're also frequently called companions. These, again, are coded terms used by people that don't really know what to do with them. Their sexual relationship isn't really that relevant, but what is relevant is that they lived for a number of years in Provincetown as a same-sex couple. And these women, like Mars and Squire and Gilmore and McMillen, were so frequently referred to as independent women, not because they lived alone necessarily, but because they lived independently of men together. Gilmore, her Whiteline woodcuts often depict women and are amongst some of the most modern and patterned and really undulating, vividly colored of the Provincetown prints. This print is called Provincetown Harbor. And as you can see, she kind of cunningly has put a bunch of mermaids on the shoreline. One of them's even taunting some of the men on this boat. And here you can see, I think that's the Pilgrim Column. So there's recognizable landmarks in this rather fanciful image. Gilmore also focused on the female nude, often placing the figure into a picturesque village scene like this that shows very familiar landmarks, the spires, like people that knew Provincetown as a tiny town, they would know what these buildings were. And there is a bit of radicalism in placing a nude female in what is such a recognizable scene to locals, which is kind of perhaps implying the artist's liberal attitude towards sexual mores. I mean, no one was posing nude al fresco, and she probably didn't use a live model, but the attitude that is reflected is one of freedom, of complete freedom. Like I said, most of her Whiteline prints usually depict women. This is a portrait of the Silva sisters, two sisters whose family often hosted artists for the summer. And you can see that the way that Gilmore used the Whiteline technique really was almost like a puzzle, like puzzle pieces of color and flat decorative surface, all pieced together to make a very simple geometric composition. I also love when Ada Gilmore depicts women just kind of being women, you know, not being precious or anything, just being themselves, like this image from 1919 that shows a woman changing out of her swimming costume on the beach in public, which was something that was considered unheard of. You know, women did not change out of swimming costumes in public. You retreated to a dressing room or one of those rowing houses. So Gilmore here is capturing the really relaxed atmosphere of Provincetown with her thoroughly modern, bright colored Whiteline prints such as this. Conversely, her partner, Dolly MacMillan, chose to exclusively work in black and white. So this lent a very distinctive, modern, kind of simple look and really set her apart from her contemporaries who were almost all working with those crazy, bright, unrealistic colors. Here you can see, this is a really early print, 1916, and it's a street scene, you know, kind of a bustling street scene in Provincetown, but it's through a window. And then in the background, you can see the single line just to indicate the horizon of the water. I lost my place. So this composition is almost photographic, like photography at the time was influencing the way people created their compositions, but it's also reflective of the Japanese prints that use this kind of skewed perspective that you often get in places like where you're near the water. And she's created it all simply with black lines. She exhibited one of these block prints in the first annual exhibition of the Provincetown Art Association in 1915. And McMillen went on to make black and white woodcuts in Provincetown until her death at age 59. The Cleveland, as you can see, this is in the collection of the Cleveland Museum of Art, and they have actually two excellent examples of her work in their collection. And in addition to the simplicity in their palette, McMillen worked rather large, much larger than the other Provincetown printers who kept their prints pretty small in scale. As you can see, this print is 17 by 20. Okay, that's not like huge, but most of the Provincetown prints that you've seen before were 8 by 10 or smaller. She stood out. She made herself different by not using the white line technique, using just black lines and working much larger than the others. While Gilmore and McMillan's complex kind of relationship continues also to confound historians, it also suggests that sexuality in this crowd was not as obvious as it always seemed. Not long after this print was made, Gilmore went on to marry a man, the artist Oliver Chaffee, and other artists like Hartley and DeMuth also engaged in heterosexual relationships, even though they were both decidedly more interested in men. But in Provincetown in this era, queerness is not always easily defined. Bisexuality was completely accepted and encouraged. But one thing is certain, being queer was not always safe. Earlier, I mentioned the invention of the white line technique has been attributed to B.J.O. Nordfeldt, but in the 1990s, a discovery in an attic actually may prove otherwise. In a trunk in that attic were thousands of prints and blocks by Edith Lake Wilkinson, a queer artist that lived with her partner in Provincetown and whose white line prints, such as this one, are actually dated to 1914, a full year before Nordfeldt even set foot in Provincetown, and 2 years before the other women even attempted to use this technique. So you can see here all of the trademarks of the white line technique. It's a street scene in Provincetown, and there's even a little cat over here, which I always have to point out the cats. Amazingly, Edith's blocks survived, and they're still stained from the bright colors that she applied to them, which gives you kind of, when the blocks exist, it gives you a rare opportunity to see the entire practice of the artist as a whole. So here you can see the block itself, but look at how luminescent and bright the colors that Edith Lake Wilkinson used. They're very abstracted colors. You know, this field is not blue, this field is not yellow, but like the Fauves and other artists working in Europe, having kind of natural colors was not of interest to artists like Edith Lake Wilkinson. Her work nearly always featured scenes of kind of provincial, Provincetown, village life, but it's that unusually bright and unrealistic palette that she used, which shows that allegiance to the modernists. And while, unlike all the other Provincetown printmakers, she didn't make it to Paris. She did attend the Armory exhibition in New York City in 1913, which was basically the most historic show of modern art available in America at the time. And she was clearly very influenced by the work that she saw there. But like I said, unlike the others, Edith tragically never made it to Paris. She had a trip planned for 1924, but a series of very unfortunate events prevented her from going on the voyage. If it was not for her grandniece, the filmmaker Jane Anderson, Wilkinson's importance to Provincetown would have definitely been lost. This filmmaker's discovery led her to create a documentary about her great aunt. It's called Packed in a Trunk, The Lost Art of Edith Lake Wilkinson. And it's a great documentary. It's available, I think it's on Tubi for free with commercials. It's worth watching. It's almost as much about the filmmaker as it is about Edith and her work. But the filmmaker is also queer and married. And so there's just a lot of overlap, and it's a really great film. So you should watch it. But Edith's life was kind of, her career was tragically cut short by prejudice and greed. So like I said earlier, Wilkinson and her partner Fanny lived together in Provincetown quite peacefully until a family lawyer had Edith committed to an asylum in 1924, about a month before her trip to Paris. And this was done to forcefully separate the two women. This family lawyer then siphoned the money that was left to Edith by her prosperous family. And he went to her studio in Provincetown, packed everything into a trunk, and sent it to her family in West Virginia, where it languished in an attic. Tragically, Edith spent the rest of her life hospitalized in asylums. And this is, at a time when being hospitalized in an asylum was about as tragic a fate that a woman could have. She never made art again. She was most likely drugged most of the time. It's a really tragic story, but thanks to her niece and the discovery of her work in that trunk, her work now has taken its rightful place alongside the very best of the Provincetown Printers. It's been in several exhibitions, and it's a part of the permanent collection of the Provincetown Art Association and Museum. But her story demonstrates that being out in Provincetown was not always safe, and women in particular were incredibly vulnerable in a world completely governed by men, without an advocate and without her family behind her. Edith was committed and had no recourse. Her partner Fanny could do nothing to get her released. So perhaps for that very reason, several of the women printmakers working in Provincetown were much more guarded about their sexuality, preferring to live quietly and more conservatively than the open couples I just described. The artist who most typifies the Provincetown Printers, and whose work is perhaps the pinnacle of this style, chose to live rather quietly, although without the influence of men. Blanche Lazzell was the quintessential independent woman. She was also very wealthy. She grew up on a large farm in a small town in West Virginia. Her family owned several coal mines. And however conservative her family might have been, they allowed her to study art. And that didn't always happen for women. First, she studied at the West Virginia University, and then at the Art Students League in New York City under the very famous painters Kenyon Cox and William Merritt Chase. And then she traveled to Paris, where she took classes at several academies, the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, Académie Julienne, and Académie de la Cluse. But eventually she really settled in to the Académie Moderne. And there she studied with several post-impressionist painters and was a fixture in the Parisian avant-garde, much like Ethel Mars and Maud Squire were. And their paths did cross. But it was actually on a trip to Italy with a group of like-minded women that Blanche first heard of Provincetown. Actually, it was an open couple, Jessie Fremont Herring and Stella Christine Johnson, both artists themselves, painters, who invited Blanche to visit them upon her return to America. So Blanche visited and fell in love with Provincetown, immediately decided to stay there. So unlike the other artists I described, Blanche made Provincetown her permanent home pretty much right out of the gate. Here you can see this is her studio. It's on the edge of a kind of ramshackle old fishing pier, and it was a falling down fish house, but she made it her own. And here you can see she's actually stayed in this tiny little ramshackle studio house over the winters. But inside the studio, you can see she has her abstract paintings and prints, and outside of the studio, she grew an abundance of flowers. And these flowers were kind of legendary, and it was one of her greatest joys, was keeping up these flowers year after year. And also they attracted attention. So something that I'll talk about is the tourism that went on. This is one of my absolute favorite pictures of Blanche Lazzell. You can see her here in Provincetown, sitting totally apart from the younger, more lively artists here in attendance. Blanche was, by all accounts, described as pretty stern, serious, and a bit of a loner, but she considered herself an avant-garde modernist just as much as these cool cats in this picture here, even though she looks like a very demure older lady. Although Lazzell was always primarily a painter until she came to Provincetown and began to make whiteline woodcuts like the rest of these women in the summer of 1916. So she's working with Nordfeld, Mars, Squire, and the others, and some of her very first efforts were in a print exhibition in the town in 1916. But it's hard to find those early ones. She didn't think they were very good, but by 1919, 1920, she had perfected the technique and was almost working exclusively in whiteline. Here you can see her entire process from sketch to block to finished print. And she often didn't make more than one print at a time. As you can imagine, while this is less labor intensive than a multi-block print, it really does take a long time to ink every single section and make these prints. So she kind of made them on demand. She kept a very organized system where her blocks all lived. And if someone wanted a print, if they saw the block or they saw the finished print, they could order one, and she would create them kind of on demand. But like the modernist paintings that she studied in Paris, her prints employ a very almost abstracted view. Here you have very fractured fishing boats, wharfs, and piers, bordering on cubist in style. You have these broad, flat blocks of colors that are not, reflecting any sort of reality, but they're rather hotly colored to kind of create a very expressionist view of the scene. Her experiments in abstraction continued into the 1920s, and she returned to Paris several times. She worked with Cubist artists there, and that began to influence, as you can see, the background of this print very much looks like a Braque or Albert Glees or Picasso. And she began to also be inspired by the nude figure. But you can see how this figure is kind of sectioned and simplified into planes, and this is all done with the white line technique, which she really, more than anyone else, became masterful at. So in her ramshackle studio that I was talking about at the end of Hill's Wharf, she hung the walls of the interior with her paintings and her prints as kind of like a private changing sales exhibition for visitors. And here you can see in this rather grainy image, her prints on view inside that studio hut. The studio was open to the public every day during the tourist season, and Blanche gave demonstrations of her printing method, which often led to the sale of her prints. So she also then began to offer classes in woodcut printing. So for Lazzell, meeting and greeting tourists was always a means for her to make money. And her painting courses brought in a lot of money. Her painting course was priced at $20 for a 4-week session. And you could also come and take individual block printing classes for $5 a lesson. And these are the prints that she's making around that time. So as you can see, she's come a long way. They've really developed into almost like precisionists, Charles Sheeler, early Georgia O'Keeffe style compositions, where all of these planes and shifting surfaces are treated with an extreme flatness. But they're really beautiful prints. And so she's selling work, but not a lot. And sales to prints to museums and galleries, you know, that did supplement her income, but also their prints. So prints don't command the prices of paintings. So what she had to do was kind of scratch out a meager existence from these lessons, from the print sales, the tourist demonstrations, and occasional support from her super rich family, who was very reluctant to give her any help at all. But she also had a steady income of coal royalties. So her coal mining family would send her a monthly stipend that allowed her to continue to be an artist full time and to live alone as a woman. You know, women at this time who were unmarried, if they weren't affluent, they would have trouble paying their rent. So these are the ways in which Blanche Lazzell was able to continue making prints and living in Provincetown and going to Europe with very expensive accommodations in Paris and making the crossing multiple times. By the 1930s and 40s, Blanche Lazzell was becoming pretty much nationally known for her white line prints. Having shown her work in galleries across the country, she was secured a spot as one of the artists who worked for the Federal Works Project Administration. She received a stipend in exchange for endorsed works that were meant to go to government agencies, post offices, libraries, museums, schools across the country as part of the WPA. And this print of her hometown, Morgantown, West Virginia, the Monongahela, was acquired by the Newark Art Museum under this program. So this was a new and exciting way for Blanche to supplement her income and to sell prints, being funded by the federal government to do so. And here's another example of one of her WPA prints, also of Morgantown, West Virginia. As soon as the WPA kind of ended, Lazzell had continued to teach throughout the 1940s and 50s, and almost exclusively to women. Her lessons were affordable and accessible to women, whereas most print shops at the time were not very welcoming to women. Many of Lazzell's students were seeking a safe place to learn printmaking, and Lazzell's little studio in Provincetown had become something of a destination for young women that wanted to learn printmaking from the master. So some of her students, such as Angela Muir, Hope Pfeiffer, and Farrell Warthen, all went out and established their own reputations as white line woodcut artists. Having learned the technique in Provincetown while visiting, they took the method back to their various homes and popularized the white line woodcut through this network of women printmakers kind of working across the country. One such artist that also did this is Cleveland's own Mabel Hewitt. She was born in Conneaut, Ohio, but was raised in Youngstown. Mabel lived in Cleveland, Parma, actually, for the last 50 years of her life, and exhibited works every single year from 1935 to 1956 at the Cleveland Museum of Art's annual May show, which was a regional show of local artists. She went to OSU. You can see her picture there. And I love this portrait of Mabel Hewitt by a recent CCAD student. And it's a white line print portrait of Mabel Hewitt. And on the left, you see her at her home studio in Parma. She's painting. She was just kind of a fixture of the art scene in Cleveland in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. But it was in 1933 that she visited Provincetown, Massachusetts for one reason and one reason only, to learn how to make white line color woodcuts from its most famous practitioner, Blanche Lazzell herself. So in that tiny wharf ramshackle studio during the summer of 1933, Hewitt took a whole series of private classes with Lazzell, and then immediately left, did not stay in Provincetown, returned to Cleveland where she began experimenting with what she learned. So you can see here's two kind of early examples of her work around the camp stove. They were both pulled in 1937 from the same block, but this is really great because you can see that she's experimenting with the palette. So on the left, you have a very warm kind of interpretation of the scene. And on the right, she decided to try a much cooler version, but you could reapply watercolors to these blocks multiple times to get differing effects and different kind of palettes and color schemes. That is something undoubtedly that that Mabel Hewitt liked about the white line woodcut technique, and Blanche Lazzell taught her that summer. Hewitt explored and really perfected the white line technique. She was experimenting with modernist ideas and producing these color woodcuts in a very contemporary modern style. And the white line technique became Hewitt's favorite medium. She actually used it for over 30 years. She produced scenes like this of people swimming. She also did kind of industrial views, being from Cleveland, that happens a lot. Landscapes based on her travels. She did travel to other locations like New Mexico. She also worked in Michigan and other kind of art colonies, but everywhere she went, she always employed this technique that she was taught by Blanche Lazzell. She said once, "I like block printing," she explained, "because it gives the family of moderate means an opportunity to have something of color and art in their homes." So you can see that Mabel Hewitt actually likes the fact that these prints are affordable and that it gives the opportunity for people that are not millionaires to own an original work of art and display it in their home. Hewitt is attracting kind of fresh attention thanks to this gradual donation of a large body of her work to the museum by her nephew, William Jury, and his wife, Rose, who started giving prints and other examples of her work and blocks to the museum in 2003. As a result, this is just like a screenshot of the first page of what's available in the Cleveland Museum of Art of Mabel Hewitt's work. As a result of this gift, the Cleveland Museum of Art now holds the largest amount of prints by the artist in the world, and put together an exhibition, like I said at the beginning, in 2010 of the woodcuts of Mabel Hewitt, which, if you were lucky enough to see, it was actually the first exhibition in the print galleries. That wall that is blocked in the background actually leads out onto the atrium now, but they were still working on the atrium at the time, so you couldn't walk through there. But anyway, it was a really spectacular show. You can see that the blocks, she often worked on both the front and the back of the block, which saves money, right? You can use both sides of the block to produce prints, and they ingeniously put them in lucite cases so you could see both sides, and then on either side of them were examples of prints from either side of the block. So it was a great show. The catalog is amazing. Of course, it's out of print and really difficult to find, but it's worth looking into. But one of the things that always kind of struck me when looking at that exhibition was how little attention was given to the fact that Mabel Hewitt, like Blanche Lazzell, was an independent woman. Whether she was queer isn't really known, but she lived her life as a quote unquote spinster, which is another one of those coded words often used to imply a woman, who lives alone and is of questionable morals and or sexual preferences. During the Great Depression in 1934, when Mabel moved to Cleveland, she moved with her sister, Edna Jury, who was a CPA, and the two of them lived alone together in Parma for the rest of their lives. So much like Blanche Lazzell, Mabel Hewitt lived on her own terms at a time when single women of a certain age, didn't do that very often. But as an artist, Mabel was able to circumnavigate some of those social norms that were required of women at the time. I mean, She's the one that was exhibiting at the art museum year after year. She's the one who sought out Blanche Lazzell and the colony at Provincetown specifically to learn printmaking. And that, I think, aligns her to this network that I'm talking about, the way that these ideas moved through the country, through women and through printmaking. These women were living outside the world of men and using printmaking as a conduit for exchange. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And we have some time for questions. So if anyone has any questions, you can unmute yourself or you can drop it in the chat.
I actually had a few questions, Brittany.
Hi, Elise.
Hello. I'm just like overall like wondering like how the art was like seen as art, because I feel like a lot of it is like talking about these women and who they were, and I feel like that was like the buzz around it, a lot of it. And I know like 1960 was Dada, right? Was that when the Dada movement in New York was coming around? So I'm just wondering like how it was perceived on the level of like that movement going on and them using like such traditional like methods in printmaking. Yeah, just that in general. And like, yeah.
So I see what you're saying. And a lot of the scholarship around Lazzell is trying to pin her as a very extremely avant-garde artist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you're saying, right? If you look at the work of people actually working in Europe around this time, I mean, it's way more avant-garde than this, right? So I don't necessarily position them as, while they worked within an avant-garde circle, the works that they were creating were not as traditional as some work. They were somewhere in the middle, right? Like they were operating on a level that was comfortable for them and comfortable in America. So you do have to remember, so 1913 was the first armory show in America. And at that time, abstract art of any kind was considered incredibly new. So America was way behind the curve when it came to this stuff. But I do think that a lot of present day scholarship on these women is trying to force them into this label as very avant-garde abstract artists, when really what they're doing, and as they got older, it even got more traditional. So yeah, they were working in a system that allowed them to create work because of their kind of outrageous attitudes and the way that they presented themselves. But the work itself was not as avant-garde as they think. And a really funny thing that happened in Provincetown was, so they had these annual art exhibitions. And in 1916, the moderns, meaning like Blanche Lazzell and all these people, demanded to have a separate show from everyone else because they considered themselves so spectacularly different and modern that they had a separate show, like almost like a salon de refusee, even though, again, if you look at their work, it's really not that avant-garde, but they were pushing some boundaries, right? At a time when in America in the 20s, you know, non-representational art was still considered almost taboo. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. And then to go off of that, one more thing was just, it's interesting how like Blanche kind of started her career with having that like studio that you mentioned, like a lot of tourists like would come to see. Mm-hmm. And it's funny when you think of it now, like if you were to go down a fishing pier and see a studio and walk in and it kind of looked like that, it would have some sort of like, you know, that kind of connotation, or it's just like, art is like a hobby sort of in that way. So like it's interesting that she was able to like grow away from that and like actually start exhibiting in like bigger museums and things like that. So I'm just kind of, I mean, you kind of explained it, but it's in like also on like how it's perceived. Like I wonder how difficult it was for her to actually like be able to step away from that.
It was difficult for her to get her work in legit exhibitions other than when she was grouped with the Whiteline printmakers, right? So there is some, a couple of them, I can't remember which one, it might've been Ethel Mars, whose work was on either sides of a Marsden Hartley at the Salon d'Automne in Paris. So in Europe, they did better, you know, like they were, because they were more open, but in America, Blanche did struggle. She struggled to be accepted as a professional artist and not a hobbyist, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you. Great answers.
Hi, I have a quick question. Thank you so much for this talk. This has been wonderful. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the socialization that was taking place in Provincetown at this time, including were there galleries where they were presenting, or was this more of a private social center where people would come over to galleries or their own studios?
It was a little bit of both. From the beginning, there were always galleries in Provincetown, but the museum and the first galleries were all started by those very traditional men that I talked about, and were funded by the colonial Yankees, you know, the old school white people. And then at a certain point, when they kind of lost control of the town's art colony, you know, they wanted the art colony to be very prim and proper and kind of do what other art colonies had done. And that's when the kind of, like I said, the separate exhibit had to happen. And so then there started to be more spaces where they could exhibit their work. Also, the actual schools themselves, the art schools had galleries in them or were like transformed into galleries. Another thing that was happening was while the theatrical things were happening there, the artists were given the opportunity to create backdrops, to create the scenery, to create the costumes. So I didn't even really get a chance to talk about those cross currents between the theatrical community and the artistic community that allowed for them to even further push the boundaries of what they were creating. But if you go to Provincetown now, I mean, it's filled with galleries, you know, and the galleries are what make Provincetown now. But it was a very gradual transformation from an art school location where there was a very white enclave to show art. And then more gradually, there were more and more galleries. But I will say this, the women in Provincetown at that time did not get as many opportunities as the men. There was actually a really strict rule that women were not allowed to open their studios and sell art except on Sundays. In 1919, I think it was, one year, where the male artists actually banded together and said, you know, you're taking away too much of our foot traffic. And so they only allowed them to open on Sundays. But then Blanche Lazzell stepped in and said, nope, sorry. She would just open her doors and people would just go in. So the studios continued to, but not everyone was wealthy enough, you know, to afford their own studio or to live there year round, you know, like that was, like I said, these were some very privileged people to be able to be there at that time. Did that kind of, my cat?
Yes, thank you so much.
Felix.
We also have a couple more questions in the chat. Melanie was wondering where you were able to find your research on these women's lives. And as a comment, she went to the Art Students League exhibit, Women in Art, although she couldn't remember the exact name. And Blanche block was included. She printed from both sides. Maybe she taught this to Mabel to save some money.
I think that most woodblock printers know about that. You know, I don't think that's something that it's just kind of even now, like, you know, but yes, she probably definitely did. And a lot of them did use both sides of the wood, but doing the research on these women's lives, it was from a variety of sources. I'm happy to send my bibliography out when we send out the recording. But a lot of it was mostly taken from the two sources that I said at the beginning. But there is a lot of individual work out there, but it really is surprising how little there is on some of these women's careers. While they're included, Blanche Lazzell is like, you know, gets the most press. So there's the most books about her. Edna Boyce Hopkins there's been a one-woman show of her work, but a lot of them are just kind of footnotes in an overall kind of story of the Provincetown printmakers. So there's definitely work yet to be done. And also the scholarship, queer theory has really only come into play, you know, really recently. It seems like it's been a long time for me, you know, when I started learning about queer theory and art history in like the early 2000s, you know, books that are recent, for example, this book, Blanche, this amazing, beautiful, huge book on Blanche Lazzell was published in 2004. And in it, it uses a lot of coded language. You know, it talks about her relationships with men. It doesn't really explore that side of her personality. While if you go to Provincetown and talk to people, they'll tell you that Blanche Lazzell had a partner named Dorothy Loeb. And, you know, while they were, you know, that was common knowledge, it doesn't appear in any of the research. Some of her papers exist. In fact, many of their papers exist in West Virginia. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for scholarship here. And like I said, this is just the tip of the iceberg for me. I'm just kind of starting and really beginning to explore their lives. Blanche is your great aunt. Wow, that's amazing.
And then Stephen was also wondering, do you not feel Blanche Lazzell's abstract works qualify as being modernist, avant-garde, or another expression of that nature?
We could argue about this all day. I have a huge problem with the modernist paradigm being applied, especially to women who are trying to work outside of the world of men. And these terms like modernism, and granted, she is learning. I mean, look at this painting. You know, she's copying the Cubists working in Paris, and they're all men. So she's learning from men. She's learning from men that consider themselves modernists. She is proud to be a modernist. She calls herself a modernist. But when you look at the entire picture of what was happening in the world at that time, some of her work does seem rather tame. And I think that also reflects her personality as a whole. I think I described how Blanche was very much private person. She was probably the most conservative of all of the people that you heard about in this presentation. And so that's reflected in her work too. But and it's not really, I don't have a lot of interest in defining and categorizing people by these labels that are increasingly being broken down by revisionist art history. And to call her a modernist, and that's the name of this book, The Life and Work of an American Modernist, that's lumping her into this category, right? So that she now is worth more because we're aligning her with this, you know, Greenbergian notion of what a modern artist is. And I'm sorry, I don't. You can be tame and be a modernist, yes, but that's what I mean. Like, so she's modern, but not in the way that these art historians are ascribing modernity to artists at the time. But that's just my opinion. Like I said, we could argue this for hours. But is any other questions? It's 7:23. We're almost finished. No? Oh, she was definitely a modernist. And I mean, she called herself a modernist frequently, touted herself as a modernist. But now, when you use that word, it has different connotations. So you got to be careful. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed this. It was recorded. we will be, I will be sending out the link to a private YouTube link to the recording, and also a link to some of my sources. If anyone is interested, you can email me. My email is brittany@zygopress.org. This is a continuing series, so I will be doing another one this summer. Topic TBD, whether or not it continues the journey that I'm doing with these printmakers. It will be on print history. So this gives me a chance to flex my art historian muscles. And thank you all for coming tonight. I really appreciate you taking time out of your evening to sit, especially when it's so nice out, to sit in front of a computer screen. So thanks everyone. Have a great night.